Hi, everybody, and happy December. It's a pleasure to be back here again with the AskHistorians podcast. Normally, as this is our first episode of the month, we would be doing a book giveaway. But as this episode is a little bit longer, I figured it would be better just to keep it all together and go right to the interview versus doing a book giveaway. However, whoever is the lucky book giveaway winner will receive an email with a few different books they can pick from. And if you are also interested in getting on the book giveaway, I recommend you come by and join our AskHistorians Patreon. That is at patreon.com/AskHistorians, as it supports and helps keep this show going. And without further ado, here is the interview.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I am very pleased to be your host today, Brian Watson, and I am especially pleased to be bringing you one of our very special crossover episodes. This time the crossover is with the wonderful women at the Dig History podcast. Today we have joining us Dr. Averill Earls, Dr. Sarah Handley-Cousins, and Doctors in Progress Marissa C. Rose, and unfortunately Elizabeth Garner-Mazurek could not join us today, but she is here with us in spirit. Averill is a historian of modern Ireland and sexuality and writes about same-sex desiring men, policing, and Dublin's queer urban spaces. She is assistant professor of history at Mercyhurst University in Erie, Pennsylvania. In addition to making podcast episodes, she is assistant layout editor at Nursing Clio. She's published a range of pieces on teaching, literature, and the history of gender and sexuality with collaborative history blogs like Notches and Nursing Clio. She tweets from at AERLS. Sarah is a historian of disability and gender in the American Civil War. She is a clinical assistant professor of history at the University of Buffalo. Her forthcoming book, to be published with the University of Georgia Press, is about disabled Union veterans during and after the Civil War. In addition to a PhD in history from the University of Buffalo, Sarah holds a BA from Wells College and a master's in education from Niagara University, and is an alum of the New York State Council for the Humanities Public Humanities Fellows. You can find her writing on Nursing Clio, where she is also an editor, and various digital news outlets, including the Washington Post and the New York Times. She tweets from at SarahBells721. Marissa is an independent information professional and PhD candidate in history at UB. Her dissertation tells the stories of lactating women for hiring in the Atlantic world during the Revolutionary era. In addition to a BA in history from Niagara University, Marissa has an MLS from the University of Buffalo. She is a former fellow at APS, the library company, and other places. Marissa tweets from ILURV History, I love history. And Elizabeth, who couldn't join us today, but I will read her bio, of course, is a historian of the welfare state and women in the progressive era of America. She is currently completing her PhD in history at the University of Buffalo, working on her dissertation and teaching American history. Elizabeth holds a BA from the University of Texas at Austin and an MA from the University of Buffalo. She is the 2017-18 Fellow in the University of Buffalo Institute for the Research on Women and Gender and the 2018-2019 Humanities Institute Fellow. And she tweets from at E.G. Mazurek, Masarik. So after all of that bio, thank you all for being here today, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
In general, I usually like to start by asking what got each of you interested in history in the first place?
Someone else go first.
Averill was not interested in history. No. So this is Marissa. So I have always been really into history, and as a kid, I would always tell my parents I was going to be an archaeologist or an Egyptologist or something. And I saw The Mummy in theaters 7 times in a row. It was just I've always been into history and historical things, and so I kind of always knew I was going to be a historian, and I'm about to become one.
That's interesting.
Well, I mean, I guess I am one, but so yeah, that's, I mean, for me, it's just been my whole life.
There's a lot of money in history out here, right?
Oh yeah, exactly. That's why I got into this business.
This is Sarah, by the way. I, like Marissa, I was always interested in history. I think mostly because I was interested in the stories. Like, I was just interested in kind of the stories that you learn in school. I don't know, George Washington or the American Revolution or whatever. I just was always kind of drawn in by that. And it was always something I was just good at in school. Like, I didn't have to think about it. I was just always good at it. But I actually, unlike Marissa, never, ever thought about being a historian. I actually don't even think I really understood that that was a thing that you could be. I really didn't. I didn't know anything about academia or being a professor. Like I just didn't. I had no framework for any of that. I didn't know anybody who did anything related to that kind of work. So I kind of assumed that you had to, like, there are certain jobs and you just have to pick one of those jobs. And one of those jobs and I wanted to be fancy. So I was like, I'm going to be an attorney. And I watch a lot of Law and Order. So that's probably
same.
why.
Yeah.
So I went to this tiny little college and was, poking around in what I wanted to major in, which was going to be English or American Studies. And I did an internship with the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office. And it was so soul crushing. Like I just hated it. I hated everything about it. And I remember thinking like, oh my God, I thought like this was just like going to be just a progression from one thing to another. And I was just going to be a lawyer and it was going to be easy. And then all of a sudden, like everything just sort of imploded. And I was like, what do I do? And so I actually went and studied in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania for a little while. And once I realized that like, oh, not only am I good at this is something that I could actually pursue. That's when I decided to do it professionally.
And Averill, I didn't really take a history class until college because I went to a really weird public school that I graduated with 36 kids. We didn't have history classes. We had like experimental crossover classes. So, my first history class was with Mario Mazzarelli at Christopher Newport University, and I guess I liked it then, but I was still gonna had this plan to be like a diplomat and learn Spanish. And
a diplomat?
Yeah,
oh my God,
I was gonna be in the foreign service. I don't know.
Can you imagine
You're the
you
least diplomatic person I've ever met.
A lawyer and a diplomat.
I was more diplomatic at the time.
Okay.
I just wanted power, I think. Yeah, and then I took a sex and modern history class when I transferred to the University of Vermont with Paul DeLon, and I think that opened my eyes to what history included, that it wasn't just old white dudes, whatever, being old white dudes. And then I guess also sort of swirling around me, unbeknownst to me, like I'd never really connected it, but like my grandma is the town historian for Ainsley, Vermont, which is what I'm named for. And so it's in my blood. And my other grandma was a teacher, but she like reread history voraciously. And once I was in grad school, we would like talk about, but I would say, hey, Graham, I'm reading this book. You should read it. And she would read it. And then we talk about it. Yeah. And I was like, it was really strange. I don't know. I didn't think that I liked history until junior year of college. And then I was like, all right, I guess this is my path. And then I got into grad school and then I got into PhD program. And I was like, all right, I guess I'm going to keep going down this path.
She's an accidental history professor.
I go where the wind blows me.
That's interesting that you say that though, because I also, once I started studying history, seriously sort of started to put things together too, that my grandfather also read history voraciously. My dad was a huge history buff, and they were so excited that I would come home and I would give them my books from my classes, and they would read them and we would talk about them. And it never occurred to me that in a way they had always been sort of shaping me with their love of history, but I didn't realize that until after I got into it.
Exactly.
I come from a very, blue collar background where nobody ever read unless they really had to. So that's, I don't think I really had people to talk to. I guess I was kind of a loser, and I just kind of read, I exclusively read pretty much historical fiction and history books, and that was what I did, was read a lot. And I was always kind of escaping into those historical worlds. And I don't know.
I read a lot, but I definitely don't read history for fun. So it's just like, I don't know what I'm doing here. Just kidding. No, I love it.
It's kind of interesting that you say that, both because I think, Averill, you mentioned that, was it you that said that your grandparents were from Vermont?
Yeah, I'm from Vermont. My family is from Vermont. My mom's from Vermont. My dad is from Massachusetts, which you can tell by the way he drives.
I'm from New Hampshire, so yes. So I'm very familiar with the whole area, and Vermont is just rich with history too.
Yeah, no, it's a.
But I kind of got into the same way Marissa did. My family, nobody really read, and I was like the loner who was reading books and reading books alone in high school, whatever. And then when I got to college, we were doing it's like a history of the world 101. And they're like, so we can interpret history this way. I was like, wait a second, we can interpret history?
Yeah.
Everything changed. So, I was kind of wanted to ask you about the podcast. That's not like a normal thing people do. I mean, whose idea was it to get from history to doing a podcast? How did this all come
It was
together?
my idea.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it was your idea.
It was Averill's idea.
Yeah. I'm a benevolent dictator, and
It's true.
I don't know. I think the idea came because I was sitting in a room. We used to have these mutually assured productivity sessions, MAP sessions, where we would sit in a room while we were writing our dissertations or working on our comp exams, because that's, isolating and awful. And so if we were at least sitting next to each other, it would feel less isolating. And I was listening as I was sitting at this table to a podcast recording of a conference paper that was related to my research. And I was like, this doesn't seem very hard. Why don't we have a podcast?
Right.
And then I was very wrong. It is kind of hard, especially at the get-go.
And I need to say that when Averill's like, this is really easy, I'm like, Averill, I just listened to a podcast episode about making a podcast, and I promise you it's not easy. It's like, no, it definitely is.
It definitely
But
is.
that's how Averill is. You can tackle anything. It doesn't matter how much background you need to have in it. Like, she can just jump in.
And she just kind of, we are doing this, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do this, and this is going to be how it is.
Yeah. And then we all kind of just jumped on sort of one at a time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We had like a little, I put out like a call to the grad listserv and said, hey, who wants to do this? People responded, and then suddenly we were in a really echoey, terrible room in the library recording our introduction episode, like one person at a time. And the rest is, not to be punny, but
that's kind of amazing. It's kind of all rolled together like that. It's like a little historical podcast commune.
Yeah. I mean, we've had some pretty significant changes since then. I mean, we at the beginning, we had this idea that we would have some episodes about history, and then we would have like some interview episodes, and then we'd have episodes about like what it's like to be a grad student. And then we realized like nobody wants to listen to that. That's horrible. Like we don't want to talk about it, let alone like have a podcast on it. So we the first year or so, we did sort of a variety of different things. It took us a while to kind of figure out what our niche was. And then we took a step back and had like sort of a visioning process where we thought about, okay, what's our brand? What kind of history are we going to do? And then we sort of relaunched as Dig. And I think that was, I don't know, I found that very useful to kind of take a step back from it. Like, now that we're doing this, what actually do we want this to be? How do we want to present it? What do we want it to do for us? And I think it's a much more focused process than it used to be.
And I think I saw that as what I wanted it to turn into after we did our very first episode, which was like we threw it together because Veterans Day was coming up right before we were intending to launch. And I was like, Sarah does stuff about veterans in the Civil War, because I just read a chapter draft of hers. So we should have an episode about this. So Sarah, Marissa, and I sat down, and Marissa mispronounced Armistice.
I called it Armistice Day, but it's apparently Armistice Day.
But the fact that, we each did a little research, we brought it to this episode, and we sat down and talked about it, that, that's that narrative research history format that I thereafter was like, this is what I want to do. I don't want to interview old people about their books. I don't want to talk about how hard it is to be a grad student, because,
it's hard.
It's hard.
Because it's hard.
Move on with it. I like the storytelling element.
Exactly.
And I like the analytical part of it. Like I'm a very, I don't know, analytical sort of historian. And so I like that we can actually make our own analysis and our own interpretations, while we're telling these stories, and use these stories as, supportive evidence for some of the arguments that we're making. So we actually get to do history and not just tell stories, which is nice too.
That's really amazing, actually. It's kind of a really wonderful working relationship that you guys all have.
Well, we're friends too in real life. So
more or less. Just kidding.
You guess you kind of like each other a little bit.
Yeah. You survive.
You said that you, when you were first doing the podcast, that you like stepped back and you took a look at everything and you like, what do I want this to be? So let me ask you that. What did you decide that you wanted your niche or your angle to be of this?
Well, I guess this was, I think I was pretty forceful about this at one point, that, and I guess I'll just be straightforward, that it was right after the 2016 election.
Yeah.
We had a couple episodes coming out or that we had planned. We hadn't recorded or even done research for them yet. And I was like, I don't want to do that. Like, I can't remember what the topic was. I think it was actually supposed to be a shipwrecks episode, which we have since done.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm not interested in doing sort of random feel-good topics anymore. I want to talk about hard stuff. And I want to talk about stuff that is important to the world that we live in right now.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about unwanted, quote unquote, unwanted immigration, right? I want to talk about birth control and sexual reproductive justice. Like I want to talk about those things. And, that was a little controversial in our, group as it existed at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one thing when we decided to relaunch, come up with a new sort of approach to what we were rebrand. Yeah, thank you. That was one thing that we decided was that we were going to come at this from sort of an explicitly feminist.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course with that also came, more thinking about what kinds of episodes do we want to do? How do we want episodes to be in conversation with each other? And so we came up with this 4 episodes at a time. We record 4 episodes at a time.
Mm-hmm.
They can be sort of interrelated. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not.
Mm-hmm.
Last one was like spooky episodes, and mine was about polar exploration. So
which can be spooky.
Yeah,
kind of spooky, cannibalism. But
the unknown.
We knew it. We wanted it to be narrative. We knew that we wanted it to be scripted and have copy. I mean, those were all decisions that we made during that.
Yeah.
And I should say the
rebranding process.
The scripting part, I wasn't so sure about, but I think the reason that the two of you convinced me to come around that way was that it could be more accessible because we would have transcripts ready to go.
Right.
If it was if the copy was already scripted out beforehand.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's important. So that's kind of how they got me to to agree that would be a good idea.
Yeah.
And even more recently, we've been including footnotes in a lot of our transcripts, which is also, I think, an important addition to our acknowledging that a lot of the work we do is built on the work of other historians. And we want to acknowledge that even if we don't always say the names of the people we're citing in our episode, we want to make sure that those citations are there alongside our larger bibliography.
Kind of like increased transparency.
And also just as sort of, in a fun way or not, dig, which doesn't necessarily convey feminist historians, is actually just because me and Sarah were going to start a consulting company.
No, we did start a
consulting company because we didn't think we were going to get real jobs. And my friend, who's a graphic designer, I don't know, we had come up with this name Dig as...
We had talked about it for a while, which is weird.
We're like, this is such a great podcasting because it's like short and it'll be punchy. It'll look really good in a small icon kind of thing. And so my friend who's a graphic designer, he created this logo for us, and I was like,
for our business,
which then died because we got real jobs.
Right. But it was good while it lasted.
Well, it was good while it lasted. And we didn't want to lose this cool, purple shovel.
Right. Yeah, so we kind of developed that into our rebranding.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you guys said that because one of the questions actually was, does it mean dig as in digital or dig as in digging history?
I pretend that it's digital in my job applications. Yeah, I do. Well, because in my cover letters, I'm on the job market right now, so I'm applying for a lot of digital humanities jobs or medical humanities jobs because I do medical history, and so yeah, I have made use of that play off of words. But I don't think we thought of the digital part of it at all.
I did.
I
definitely
did.
Yeah.
Okay.
When I was thinking of hashtags that would really lend nicely to is because
Dig history.
Dig hist is the digital history hashtag.
Oh my gosh, you're so smart.
So,
okay.
But also, like digging deeper, the feminist angle, and
our first photo shoot was us all dressed up like with all of our glasses on because most of us wear glasses and like digging with shovels.
We had a lot of old shovels.
Yeah. And we're unearthing all of this history.
Well, yeah, and I think that for me, at least the way that I've always thought about it is that there's a lot of history podcasts out there. And a lot of them, at least from my perspective, rely on very surface level interpretations of history, right? Like they're telling the same old stories, kind of feel good stories about militaries and armies and war and white.
Yes, yeah.
And we're digging deeper than
Yeah.
that. You know,
Yeah.
we are trying to tell different kinds of stories, but also like if we have an episode, because I'm a military historian essentially, but I try to even in my own work drill into a kind of a deeper look at that rather than just kind of triumphal narratives about, you know,
Yeah.
successful armies or whatever.
I think one of the themes is that we always try to get at lived experiences
Yeah,
of
right.
people at a certain time in a certain place. We very rarely do more general sort of political history. We actually talk about ordinary people who don't typically get much airtime when it comes to history podcasts.
I
Yeah.
was going to say, absolutely. I think there needs to be more feminist podcasts, and it was very hard for me not to go, fuck yeah, when you guys were explaining that.
Yeah.
And that does kind of
For
lead
sure.
me into the next question. Jen Binnis, she runs the Ed History 101 podcast, and she's also one of the moderators.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
She had the question, she wanted to know why it is so important and necessary that you're women historians. Why does gender matter? And like, what sort of perspective does it give you?
So many things. I mean, we signed on to Recorded History, which is a podcasting network, in January of this year. And immediately in this group of where we're at, like 40 or so podcasts right now, I think we're one of only a couple all women podcast groups. And
The other one is Art History Babes.
yeah, Art History
Mhm.
Babes. And then only a couple other women entirely in this entire network. So we are, you know, back in that representing a minority group in a larger sense, which is professional history.
Yeah.
It's about what we, you know, women also know history, right? The kind of
Right.
movement.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think that, I mean, like we said before, history podcasts are having a moment. They've been having a moment for a couple of years, you know, and one of the reasons that, or one of the things I think about a lot is the fact that all of the most downloaded, most listened to podcasts, you know, they're all done by men. And they're often done by men who have no historical training.
Yes.
Which is fine. You know, like that's something that appeals to a lot of people. But I think that it's high time that there are more women voices in podcasting and that more people listen to women's voices in positions of authority, speaking authoritatively about history.
Yes.
I think that maybe we're coming to a point within the academy where that's, you know, more standard. I don't think that that's the case outside of the academy. I think that average people are still accustomed to hearing men as the authorities in the world of history. Turn on the History Channel, right? All the people that you will see on like, you know, those kinds of pop history shows are often men or very, very hot women.
Yes.
Right. Which there's nothing wrong with that, but we're hot women.
Right. Obviously. Well, and I also think that this kind of came from like a desire to close the gap between academic history and popular history. I mean, we want to take ordinary people who don't have PhDs seriously, and we take them seriously, and we think that they are capable and
they're
wanting.
Interested.
They're interested. They're wanting to hear this more complex analysis, and they're wanting to benefit from the skills that we have learned in our professional training. So that's another aspect, and I think it's good for, you know, women to be the ones doing that because there's plenty of women out there who love history and who never realize that you can actually talk about the history of, you know, obstetrics, or you can talk about the history of, I don't know, adoption or something. I mean, you know, that's because all they're hearing is histories about the Roman Empire or whatever.
Right. And that's actually, I will say too, that it is still important to highlight the fact that there are women who study these things that are not traditionally associated with women, like the history of obstetrics or whatever.
Right.
Because there are still, in the Civil War history world, there's still an underrepresentation of women in history, or in that field. There's a huge contingent of women that are making huge strides there, but they're also often very easily dismissed, especially by people outside of the academy. So it is still important to kind of, again, prove that women are doing this work and that we can produce things that are just as interesting as whatever that guy's name is.
He cannot be named.
No, I'm just kidding.
And also, I think we can like be a light in that world, because I was just at the North American Conference of British Studies October, and we had like someone put out a message on Twitter hashtagging the NACBS. Any women who feel like they want to get together and start a women's caucus for British Studies, meet in the pub. And we did. And, you know, like 40 people showed
Wow.
up, and it was very clear from that gathering that we often feel isolated, right?
Yeah.
I work in a department that's me and 4 men, right? And
British history is particularly
yeah,
run by men.
By men, yeah, exactly. It's nice to know that there are others out there and that we can be a voice in this particular genre of history storytelling.
I think that's so important and interesting too, because it's just like you were saying, when you turn on the History Channel, it's just like another old white cis man. You're like, oh god, this is exhausting. So exhausted.
Yeah.
I like that really beautiful Suzanne woman who has
Lipscomb.
Oh my god!
Actually, I really
she's
love.
Wonderful.
She's great.
No, I love her too, but not all women. You don't have to be beautiful to be a women historian. Yes.
You can fit into a corset.
So next I have a series of 3 now, actually, specific questions asked about your individual research from various people. That works for you guys?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one is for Dr. Earls. It says, Dr. Earls, thank you for doing this today. I'm curious what it means to be a historian of queer spaces in Ireland, given that Ireland seems to be historically and still currently have a lot of prejudice against queer people. Can you talk about how queer people made spaces in Ireland and what remains of those histories today?
Certainly, and please call me Averill. Only my students call me Dr. Earls, and even then, not always.
I was reading from the message.
My work focuses on 20th century Dublin, and eventually will also incorporate Belfast. But you're absolutely right that for queer people, particularly queer men, it was very challenging to exist and to find, sexual outlets and even love in Ireland in the 20th century up until 1993, and even really until quite recently. And that's in part because the Irish, when they gained independence in the 1920s, they maintained the gross indecency laws that outlawed desire between men from the British government. So, and the Irish government, which was sort of predicated on this Irish Catholic nationalist, sexually pure, chaste ideology, cracked down really on same-sex desiring men in particular in the decades following independence. And you can see that in my work because, that my work is examining the arrest records, police surveilling same-sex desiring men in the streets, which is unfortunately one of the few places that we have evidence even of the existence of these men, because it was such a homophobic place that few stayed, many queer men emigrated outright, and those who did stay, had to stay closeted for fear of social and legal ramifications. So, but what my work shows, and actually it's funny that this interview and this question comes right now, because I just connected with this guy, Sam, who is a public historian in Dublin, who has written a little bit on some of the queer spaces. He does interviews with men who grew up in the 60s and 70s and 80s in Dublin. And we're like finding all these great places where his work is intersecting with mine. Like there's this place in Dublin called Beresford Place. In the 30s and 40s, there used to be a hotel there, which was known in the community as a meeting spot for queer men. And this is what he has discovered in his he's like picked these out of oral interviews and some memoirs. And then my work shows that at that same spot, like right across from the hotel, there was from the 40s, 50s on a public urinal where men used to go and hook up, and where the police used to sit outside and wait for queer men to sort of show their colors and fondle each other in the various in the cubicles. So like he and I are finding these crossroads where what we've both been doing in these isolated circles are matching up really perfectly. So I'm really excited to sort of collaborate and talk with him a bit more, because there are so few of us who even work on queer Irish sexuality that it
is kind of amazing how you kind of just serendipitously run into people who are like intersecting with you, but also who are just like doing this really deep research in a different angle of your work all the time.
It's been really nice. And so, of course, Ireland decriminalized homosexuality in 1993, which, I have made the argument in some places that's largely because of the Celtic Tiger, which is the economic boom that Ireland experienced in the 1990s on the on the sort of snowball effect of the policies and cuts that Jack Lynch in the 70s and 80s had implemented. So once Ireland had something else to hold on to besides God, besides Catholicism, they had money for the first time in the 20th century, really, in the last 200 years. It was almost like that was a moment of opening where they could let go a little bit of these really strict sexual purity laws, and they could talk about sex on TV, and they could talk about unplanned pregnancy and have actual sex education classes that did something in their schools. So it's actually remarkable how much Ireland has changed since 1993 to today. It's just been a really rapid turnaround in terms of social climate for queer people. Just in 2015? Was it 2015?
It was before here, same-sex marriage.
Yeah, it was 2015.
I think it was 2015.
The Irish people voted on their constitution to legalize same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
To change their actual constitution. Like, the population went out, 2/3 voted for this. So that's remarkable to me. And it's partly because with economic boom, young people were finally able to come home and bring back those liberalizing, progressive sort of ideas and fight that fight that they haven't been able to fight because they had to leave. They had no jobs. They couldn't get jobs. They couldn't make a living. So it's been changing really, really rapidly. And just this past year, they voted to finally decriminalize abortion in some circumstances, which is also remarkable for a country that, 2 years ago, if you mentioned abortion, you still get into a fist fight in the streets, right? It's been a hot topic and really, really fascinating. That's why I love studying Ireland. It's an interesting case study. And
yeah, it's almost like I still get chills when I think about them overturning the gay marriage ban a few years back. It's like, wow.
Yeah, I remember it.
The next question I have is for Sarah. It was from a PM that was sent to me. It says, your bio says that you study disabled people coming home from the Civil War. Did these people face PTSD and maltreatment like the Vietnam veterans? What was unique or not about the Civil War compared to later American wars in this way?
So the first thing that I'll say is that actually this is like an immensely controversial subject in Civil War history. This is just like an ongoing fight. I just got some dispatches from the Southern Historical Association meeting that happened a couple weeks ago, that there was a panel that this was the kind of the exact question. And it was, it's just an ongoing debate whether or not Civil War veterans had something akin to PTSD, or whether we can use the PTSD as a diagnosis when talking about Civil War veterans. So I'll talk about, what I have found. And I'll say first, I don't use the term PTSD. I don't apply that to Civil War, people of the Civil War era, because that diagnosis didn't exist. Doctors wouldn't have applied that to someone. And in fact, doctors really didn't apply any kind of label that we might recognize today to sort of the psychological effects of war. Some doctors did recognize that soldiers were coming home and were different. And they did often chalk that up to something that had happened during the war, that it was somehow related to the war. Many of them disagree over what exactly it was, right? The one diagnosis that does exist is soldier's heart or irritable heart, which was sort of a heart condition that if you read the symptoms of today, we might think of it as an anxiety disorder or panic attacks. But it was seen as an actual heart condition. But what I see in my work is what I and a couple of other historians like Diane Miller Somerville call war trauma. And I believe very strongly that Civil War soldiers had it, many Civil War soldiers had this trauma. And I personally, I think that it's kind of incredible that we could try to argue that somehow soldiers of the Civil War weren't affected by war the way that we know that human beings are affected by war. I think it's kind of borderline absurd to try to make the argument that they didn't or they weren't, right?
Kind of silly.
Yeah. We know that war creates disability. It's one of the central aspects of war is wounding, right? It's part of kind of the goal of war is to hurt and maim and kill. So the idea that somehow the Civil War, because we like to think of it as a glorious war, didn't create that kind of disability, I think is kind of absurd. But, what made it different than, say, Vietnam? Well, I mean, it was a very different kind of psychological landscape in terms of seeking treatment. Soldiers didn't really have a framework to understand what they were feeling, and their families didn't either. So the last chapter in my book, which is coming out this spring, is about how soldiers...
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. How soldiers thought about what they were dealing with, and how their families thought about it. And one of the things that I find is, for certain soldiers, especially if they had symptoms that were really intense, or for soldiers who their trauma kind of came out or manifested in violence, were often institutionalized because their families just simply couldn't deal with it, and often became the victims of that violence, that aggression, right? And so they were separated. And what I saw a lot was families sort of lamenting this feeling that the war just never ended for them. Like it just continued and continued, because whether they were on the front lines or whether they were in an institution, their soldier was still gone. And trying to understand what that meant and why that had happened and whether or not it was worth it. And what soldiers after the Civil War are not dealing with, what we are, at least many people believe that Vietnam soldiers dealt with after Vietnam, right? Kind of coming back to a indifferent or even sort of hostile society, which we know historically isn't a totally accurate way of understanding Vietnam veterans, but Civil War soldiers didn't really have to deal with that. In the North, anyway, they came back to a really accepting society, or a society that was very thankful for their sacrifices. But I will say that, civilians, North and South, didn't, in the same way that civilians today don't, didn't understand the experience that these men had been through. And so as much as they were sort of wanting to celebrate them, they also couldn't understand the experiences that they had had. And so there is still a disconnect between veterans and average people, which is something that we still, veterans today talk about, right? That's one of the most difficult things about coming back from, say, being in Afghanistan or Iraq or somewhere else, is that you can't share what you've experienced, because who would understand it except for another soldier? I hope that answered your question.
I hope it answered the question too. I'll follow up with them and see if they did. They prefer to remain anonymous, but I'll see how they felt about it. The final specific question is from me, actually, is for Marissa. I actually did the opposite of you did. I went from a history into information science. So I'm kind of curious what made you make that move from going the other way. What sort of things did you learn from information and library science that you can apply to history, and what can listeners learn from both fields?
So as I mentioned a little earlier, I'd always planned on getting my PhD in history, maybe not always, but since I can remember. So when I went into a library science program, I did that because I was not quite ready to commit to a PhD program. And I felt like I wanted some kind of, vocational backup if a history PhD did not get me a job.
Yeah.
So I thought, and I'm kind of addicted to school. So once I was done with my bachelor, I felt like I took one semester off and then thought, this is not going to be okay. So I'm going to go back to school. And, in a lot of ways, I'm glad that I did, because I find that I think about source material differently than some historians. I'm a lot more analytical, and I think a lot more about metadata and new modes of interrogating my sources. And I'm not saying that I'm the only historian who can do that. There's plenty of historians who are great at that. But for me, that is what library information science did for me. And another big thing is technology. So I was I'm not going to say I was a Luddite or anything. I grew up in, the 90s and early 2000s, so I've always used computers, but I did have a little bit of that feeling in me that, that, kids these days are just using too many computers or whatever. I did kind of feel like, oh, I miss, reading books, made of paper and all of that stuff. And there are some librarians who feel like that, but for the most part, library and information sciences is very progressive when it comes to introducing technology into the classroom and into research methodology. So I think that kind of brought me over to the other side, and I realized, hey, there are some negatives to a sort of digital society, but there are also some amazing skills and things that we can do now because we have some, new programs or new methodologies that came out of the digital turn. So for me, I think that has made me a better historian and helped me to think outside of the box when it comes to my source material. And I'm very into, using sources that people don't typically use. I also like to integrate popular genealogical methods into my research. So anytime I come across someone in any kind of record, I do a full workup of their genealogy and find as many records about them and their parents and everything as I possibly can. And that is something that a lot of historians do, but, a lot of historians don't, because some historians are working from these kind of full sources, like a historian of Victorian Britain or something. Yeah. They have like hundreds of Queen Victoria's diaries or whatever, they're working with all of this material. I, on the other hand, work with, 18th century wet nurses who left no records behind, at least not on purpose. So I think my information science skills have really helped me to be able to do histories about people who have left very few records behind. My digital literacy is just a tad better than it would have been if I hadn't been in that program. How do you see? You said that you went the other way around.
I got my master's in history from Drew University in history of sexuality and history of the book. So I was always already sort of close to library information sciences. I was actually originally going to go for a PhD, and then I was like, the job market does not look so great right now. And this was a few years back, so it's doing a little bit better now than it was then. So I took some time off. I won an award for my master's thesis. So I was like, well, I'll just take some time off and I'll go finish researching it and make a little book out of it. So I did that, and then made a book, and I was on Conan last year for that, and that was a lot of fun, but I don't really have a job yet. So I was like, okay, consider library science. And I came back here, and I've seen, having started history first had made me much better at doing archives and digital humanities and library science. And it makes me, I'm probably going to pursue a PhD in information sciences, but I'm always bringing that kind of historical context to the things I do, where a lot of students either don't care about that or don't have that particular historical context as a way of looking into why they're doing what we're doing, and like the historically constructed nature of like Library of Congress, for example.
Right. Yeah. I found when I was in the program, I missed history desperately because I felt like we were just talking about methodologies and how to do things, but I wanted content. I was like starving for content. So any project that I was able to do, I made it a history project. I think I had like an international copyright class that was all about international copyright law. And so I made this giant project about the history of international copyright. I was making a bored face right now. Like I understand, and I think historians have a lot to offer to library science.
Mm-hmm. I think I come at it too. A lot of the time, I come at it with making things too much, just because I'm so used to writing at write multiple page papers every week for history class that like when I walk into library science and I write 10,000 words instead of like 3,000, I'm just like, oh god, no.
Right. No, it is. It's hard to adjust. I had that problem too. And I remember my library science, teachers saying like, we're talking about method here and you're, on and on about content. And I was like, well, what's the point of talking about method if you can't use method to talk about content?
Yes, exactly.
So, it can be frustrating, but I see how the two disciplines work really well together.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, the archive too, especially. It's just like the key of both of them.
I'm obsessed with, I took a records management class and then an archives management class, and I'm obsessed with records management. That sounds like the most boring thing on the entire universe.
Yeah, no.
But I'm super into organizing files and, creating databases of files. I don't know. I find it very calming. So that's kind of what I do as a side gig.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also indexing Sarah's book for her right now.
True.
And I've indexed another book for a professor of ours.
That's pretty awesome.
It's awesome because you can kind of do social justice indexing, and that's kind of what I do. Instead of just indexing like, oh, here are all the important white men by their last name, I would pick up on interesting threads about body or disability or violence or, anything. And I kind of index those subjects and index people who I think are important, but who are not typically, indexed because, whoever indexed them decided they weren't important enough. So there's also that aspect of information science that I think is awesome, the social justice aspect.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I think you do get an advantage of like when you're looking at somebody's library or looking at the work that a group of people are doing, you kind of get to see where the intersections happen. Like all of your 4 intersections are all about like people who are like slightly minoritized or slightly removed from the masculine cis heteronormative world. And like that intersection is really interesting. Just seeing like how all of your work overlaps with you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you've noticed that. I'm glad that we're on brand then.
Yeah. You are on brand. My next question is from a female high school student who's interested in history. She asks, should she try to go for school for a history PhD? Am I likely to get a job doing that?
That's such a hard, can I just jump in here? Because I feel like this is a question that
it's for everybody.
We get, I don't mean that we get it all the time. I mean, it's just a question that comes up for people who study this all the time, right?
Like, does she want to get a PhD?
Yeah, that was the question.
Okay. Yeah.
I remember being in so many brown bags through graduate school about what are we going to do? What is the point of this? And it's just, what I always came back to was, you need to do something that you love. Right. And I don't know if it's going to work out. When I was doing it, I didn't know it was going to work out. And there was a lot of times that I thought, what am I doing? I made a terrible decision. Looking at people that I knew who had, gone to school for something else. And I can't even give you an example. All I can think of is my husband, right? He's a lawyer. He got a job. I could have done something else. I could have been a hairdresser. I could have a job right now, and then I had to keep coming back to the fact that that's not what I am good at. It's not what I want to do. It's not what I envision myself doing. And you have to find the thing that you like, and you have to find the thing that you're passionate about. And maybe it's going to work out. None of us thought that we would end up getting jobs, right? I mean, we never felt 100% confident that as soon as we walked out in our robes on graduation day, there would be somebody standing there, with a job application in their hand, like, please come work for us. Like, it's all of this is on a wing and a prayer, right? Like, at some point you have to do that. I will also say the market is really hard, so if you think you want to do it, but you got to work your tuchus off, and you've got to do twice as much as somebody may have had to do 15, 20 years ago. I mean, this is one reason why we have a podcast, right? Mm-hmm. We have Averill and I both work for Nursing Clio, which is a history blog. We are hustling all the time to make sure that we are marketable in a dozen different ways, right? And that our CVs have a million different things on them that make us really desirable as candidates, because you can't just rely on, I have a PhD.
Yeah.
Because that's not going to, if you're going to do it, you got to really hustle.
And there isn't one job that you can do with a history PhD.
Yes.
So you will get a job. It's just a matter of what kind of job you want.
Right.
If you are committed to only having a tenure track professor job, then that's going to be harder. But if you are going to end up, teaching high school or teaching non-traditional learners or something, or working in a museum, or doing a history podcast, or
working
whatever
at a university press, or at a regular a trade press.
If you're gonna be happy with that, then the job part's not a problem at all.
Right.
I think I always just said to myself that I'm not doing this in order to get a job.
Right.
I'm doing it because you do it.
Exactly.
And so I thought to myself, if I have to work at Rite Aid for the rest of my life, will I have regretted doing this PhD?
Yeah.
And my answer was always no, because the actual experience itself is what I want.
Yeah.
So I think that this particular person who asked the question, it all just depends on what you think, what your goals are.
Mm-hmm.
And I always just went for what I loved, and it has worked out well so far. I'm not rich or anything, but that's not the most important thing in life. So
yeah, I think I did not think that I was going to be a history professor at the end of a PhD. I thought I just wanted a PhD in history.
Yeah.
And I don't want to discourage anyone from pursuing a PhD, because at the end of the day, we are at the front lines of some of the most cutting edge historical research in our field. And so, there's like this debate, are PhD programs too bloated? And maybe some of them are, and some of them are producing students who aren't going into tenure track jobs, which is sort of how academia measures the success of a program.
Right.
But also, I rely so much on dissertations that I find in ProQuest and the thesis databases, just to be able to tell a richer, more full story of the history of the world. That we need people to still want to do this, to not be afraid to enter this journey, because a PhD it's a PhD sometimes for a PhD's sake.
I should say a humanities PhD, those are the programs that are being squeezed the most. But I personally think, being on the job market now, that biomedical science programs, as well as some engineering programs, they're all starting to realize the value of the humanities.
Yes.
And they're realizing, oh my gosh, we just cut our humanities program, but like now we have to hire someone in the biomedical sciences department that's just going to teach humanities, because they're realizing the humanities are necessary not only to be good humans, but also to, have the critical thinking skills, to be able to empathize with others, things like that, especially in the medical sciences, they're like, wow, we need to emphasize these humanities more. Right. So I recommend to not read too much into the humanities crisis at the moment.
Yeah. And I think too, like, a lot of the hysteria about the humanities crisis comes from people that don't really got to worry about it all that much. Right. A lot of it comes from people who are safely entrenched in tenure track positions, who are, worrying about the strength of their PhD programs. Like, are our students getting jobs? Right. I always just felt like that was something that was a narrative that was being given to us as graduate students. At least this was my impression when I was a student. And of course, that made all of us panic. But I don't know. I'm not sure that it was all that worth it. All the panic.
Yeah, don't buy into the hype.
Yeah.
And in the end, we could have made our history consulting business work.
Yeah. I mean, there's a million different things that you can do, and you've got to. I mean, you could. There are. I just listened to a study. In fact, I'm going to talk about it in my episode that we're going to record this afternoon on NPR. Was all about how students come into colleges with a desire. They express a desire to major in the humanities. Once they get to college, they feel immense pressure to major in STEM fields. Then they major in those STEM fields because they're promised jobs as soon as they walk out, and those jobs aren't waiting for them because STEM fields are increasingly looking for students with humanities degrees, or with more background in a variety of different trainings. So it's not as
cut and dry.
Yeah.
This person did have a second question, but I'm actually going to save it to the end because I think it's a good concluding one. The next question was from user Commustar. Did any of you see the interview with the Chronicle of Higher Education with Joe Lepore?
Yes.
He said that she made some provocative and critical comments about the retreat of academics, especially humanists, from public discussion.
Yeah.
He was asking kind of like what you thought about her critique, and as historians and podcast hosts, how do you guys see your role in bringing history into the public life?
Yeah.
I think basically our podcast is the answer, right? Like the goal of our podcast is to be public intellectuals, in particular in the field of history, right? That's exactly what we're doing. This is the audiences we're trying to reach. And I think I've read a couple of pretty salient points from folks, especially on Twitter, which is effectively the public discourse right now,
Right.
who are like, listen, we're out here hustling on Twitter every day, engaging with the public nonstop. And Jill Lepore's not on Twitter, so how would she know? She's not tuned in maybe to the wide number of academics who are making history podcasts, just like we are.
Yeah, just because you're not doing it doesn't mean other people aren't doing it.
And I actually that gets to a really important point, is that, and I want to say very firmly at the beginning, I'm a huge fan of Jill Lepore. I know I'm in this room, I am the Jill Lepore fan of of us three.
I mean, I appreciate what she does. Yeah, I can't read it.
I love her work. I really do, and it's had a great impression on me in my own writing.
Me too. Yeah.
I think one of the key points that I think Averill just made is that she probably is not aware, or she is envisioning a different kind of public discourse, right? She is thinking, people need to be doing what I am doing. And what I am doing is being a public intellectual, meaning I write for the New Yorker, right? I write books that are published by the trade press. When in reality, there are tons of historians doing work that is actually probably getting to many more people than the New Yorker ever is. And the New Yorker's great, right? But like, for instance, my older brother has an associate's degree. That's the extent of his education. Very intelligent guy. He's never read the New Yorker in his life. He listens to history podcasts every day, every single day while he works. We might have, I don't mean us as a dig, but like history podcasters probably have a broader reach than the New Yorker or history
certainly
blogs.
Cumulatively.
And there's also, think of, this isn't exactly, this is like something like Hamilton, or thinking about the Holocaust Museum in New York, where you have to enter a lottery to get into the frigging door.
Right. Or the African American History Museum. Right.
Yep. I mean, that is those things are happening. And that is public history, and that is public intellectualism, and it should be recognized as such.
And I also want to say, my mentor, Carol Emberton, makes this point every time this question comes up. And she says, I don't understand why teaching isn't considered when we have these conversations. When she or I or Averill stands up in front of a classroom full of young men and women who are going to probably not become history PhDs and go into the ivory tower themselves, right? They're going to go on to be whatever. They are getting that is a kind of public outreach, right? Like you are teaching these students who are going to go on and take what they've learned out into the public too. And in that sense, we have a huge impact, right? Or we have the potential to have a huge impact for those who are paying attention and not, playing on their phones. But
and digital humanities projects are also another version of that. There are just, regular, ordinary people sitting at home who come across London Lives or something. And those were all done by academic historians, offering free resources to anybody who wants them. That's also public service and public history.
Now, I think on the flip side of that, to acknowledge Jill Lepore's point, I think all three of us can also attest to that there is resistance to actually fund these kinds of programs. Our podcast, even though we are sort of technically associated with the University of Buffalo because that's where we got our educations, it's where I currently work, they've never supported the podcast. It was done purely of our own initiative. Averill mostly has paid for everything we've ever done. Nursing Clio, sort of technically a product of the University of Michigan, but never supported it, never gave it a red cent, all funded by us. There's great reluctance to acknowledge this kind of work on CVs when somebody's applying for a job, as we've been talking about a lot recently. It doesn't necessarily have I guess my problem comes down to there's always a lot of talk about like, we need more public intellectuals. We need history people to do more of this work, but we're not actually going to do anything to fund it or to support it or to have it count towards tenure or towards, your dissertation or what have you.
So if you think that's important and you value it, then you need to fund it.
Yeah, you need to put your money where your mouth is.
And a lot of places there's tons of public history and digital history programs hiring right now.
Yes.
That's one of the most common assistant professor jobs out there right now is public or digital history or medical humanities. So it's out there. It's just a fledgling little movement still. That's all.
Right. And is it Kevin Gannon? tattooed professor.
Yes.
I think he more than anyone, I read his threads of responses to Jill Lepore's article, and he was like, listen, I was in a Netflix documentary, which is like probably more people have watched the 13th than have read all of Jill Lepore's books, which I appreciate, again, the work that she does. It's great work. She's a great writer. Everyone, who loves American history, who loves Jill Lepore. But that's not the only venue in which one.
Right. We have more downloads than probably all of our advisors' books have sales. And that counts for something. I mean, it's not the same as a published book in an academic press. It's not the same thing, but the reach means something.
Yeah.
And what does public intellectualism even mean? Does it mean, are we engaging with the current public debates that need to be engaged with?
Then yeah.
Right.
Well, and then you're accused of presentism.
And
for sure.
Good. I'm a
presentist.
I live in the present. I study the past, but I live in the fucking present.
Right. I think that's right. Before we started recording, you guys asked me like how I got into this, and I kind of like, if you had asked me 2 years ago, I would have agreed with Jill. I would have said that, historians haven't done a good job of justifying their purpose or existence to the larger American public, and that's why you're seeing the funding. That's why you're seeing like all the money going into STEM and science, because they can be like, oh, well, at least we invent stuff, and at least we can play the stock market or whatever. But I think doing podcasts for the past couple of years, I don't think Jill, and this is not a critique of her. I mean, her Wonder Woman book is like one of the most influential books in my life, and I love her as a writer.
I love that book so much.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think she is hearing those voices on Twitter or podcast or some of the other ways of doing history. I mean, we've done millions of podcast downloads, but like on a Reddit thread where I've answered a question on sleeping paddles in the Middle Age, I can see that I got 500,000 people reading that and learning something from it.
Right.
And, and I don't think she's really seeing that. The other part of his question was, I think you sort of answered it, but if you have any more thoughts on it, have you found it difficult to persuade other academics to take podcasting seriously and to participate in it?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
To participate in it?
I will say actually that I now am in this strange position of now working as a faculty member in our department that that Averill and I graduated from, and that Marissa and Elizabeth are now graduate students in. And I will say that our department, short of actually funding, right, the podcast, they're enormously proud of it. They see it incredibly positively, and they're really supportive of it. They boost it as much as they can. They love the university loves to make a big deal out of it. We were on the University of Buffalo homepage for a little while, which was the most unflattering picture that has ever been taken.
No, that picture was the good one.
Every person who worked at UP, every time you open their browser, our faces were there.
Right. So, I mean, I think that they are very glad that they're very proud of the fact that students from their department are doing this. I think that they're glad that we're, doing something that's different and innovative and fresh. There is that support. Now, being in it, being a part of it, we've never convinced anybody in our department to join us. But then again, that's not the kind of podcast we have. So we've never actually, although we have highlighted their work often.
And my university, Mercyhurst University, is obsessed with this podcast, and they want to count it as my scholarship. They gave me a Teacher Scholar Award for podcasting last year. So,
very unusual.
Which is unusual that they would count that.
I think it's reflective of changing, of willingness to change particularly in liberal arts schools.
Yeah, well, especially at Research One universities, like research universities where, they kind of hang their hats on
peer-reviewed journals.
This real intensive, research and having this like really robust research agenda, and they're less focused on teaching. Those universities are going to be the hardest ones to convince.
Yeah.
But I've talked with other people whose public history, public intellectualism projects, if they're at R2s or liberal arts schools, they have worked with their administration to have it count toward their
Mhm.
scholarship
Mhm.
sort of requirements for tenure. So it's possible, certainly, and it's it's benefited me so far.
I have one final question for our closing question. It's from user JWash1894. And he says, do you see any parallels for anybody? Do you see any parallels with the suffragette movement of the 1910s and the Me Too movement of the 2010s?
Whoa.
Whoa!
Oh my.
Hello.
Come to the quick here.
I would say, as the Americanist.
So I have some thoughts. And I'm
I
not
was going to say,
Americanist, but-
it's a kind of same similar things happening in Great Britain, right?
Right.
Okay. But anyway, so I'm still going to talk first. I would say probably yes, there are some, but one major thing that I would say is that, the suffrage movement, the women's rights movement through the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century, at least in the United States, works very hard to keep their message on the vote. They were very focused on keeping it a focused campaign. And actually there are big debates over whether or not to include other things, like, should we talk about domestic violence? Should we talk about getting women the right to, divorce or custody, or, and there are many women's rights activists that say, no, like, we don't want to have those conversations. They might acknowledge that those are important, but they were very focused on keeping it on the vote. And so I think that's an important distinction to make, where I think Me Too is much broader, right? It's talking about a lot more, sexual harassment and abuse and rape and all of these things that the suffragists really were not quite ready to talk about. Who's the one who is talking about it? And it's Victoria Woodhull, and she's called a harlot, right?
Well,
She's
and some of
crazy.
them, some of them did kind of, the temperance movement sort of bled into
Oh,
that
sure,
a little bit.
yeah.
So they weren't
They did talk
wholly
about domestic
single-minded.
violence.
Yeah. But I think one big difference too is that it's women against women in a lot of ways. So at the time there were women saying, oh no, we shouldn't be able to vote. Like, we're idiots. They didn't use those words, but they,
Right.
but they were basically saying, oh, we shouldn't vote. And now too, there are plenty of women who are, leaders in the Me Too movement, but there are also plenty of women who are quote unquote siding with more conservative elements and saying that, that the Me Too movement is bullshit.
Phyllis Schlafly. They're playing the Phyllis Schlafly role, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And there always will be. And there, in a way, right? Why would we be surprised that there wouldn't be?
Right.
Women.
Right. They grew up in the patriarchy too.
Exactly.
So you internalize all of that. And that's something that people are just starting to realize, that women and men are raised in the patriarchy, and we're both enforcing it. So
I hope that one big difference, though, is the intersectionality of the Me Too movement versus the suffrage movement.
Yeah.
Because if we haven't gotten to a place where we're thinking intersectionally.
Well, and Me Too was founded by a Black woman,
right.
Was first created by a Black woman. There are incredibly important aspects of the Me Too movement that are about the particular needs of, say, Latino, domestic workers in hotels and things like that. Whereas in the 19-teens and early 1920s, who is it? Alice Paul, tells Ida B. Wells that she's got to march in the back of the suffrage parade in 1917, right? So hopefully we have. I can't say hopefully, we have kind of progressed past that. I think there are still major problems with that. White wealthy actresses kind of started to take over Me Too at certain points. I think that they noticed that they were doing that and sort of stepped back a little, but
sorry. I think your point about patriarchy damages everybody. It damages the men raised, and it damages the women raised, and it damages everybody raised within a patriarchal society. And I think that does lead us into that final question from that high school student from earlier. She asked, what do you think women should learn from history? A lot of it seems like it's written about men and war.
Oh, but I love men and wars. No, I'm just kidding. But not really.
No, she does. But that's why we need more women doing history, because history is semi-biographical or autobiographical. We don't write our history books about ourselves, but our interpretations are colored by our own life experiences. They're always going to be. And the reason that history so far has been about white men is because it's white men who are writing it. So the more people of color and the more women historians that there are, the more voices there are going to be. So, to that particular person, I would say, buy the books of women historians.
Yeah. And I think that you said that this young woman is in high school, right? Yeah. So I think that part of that, it's so hard to put yourself back into like what you were learning in high school. But I think from my recollection, you learn what you're supposed to learn for the tests, right? For the AP exam or for the Regents exam here in New York State. And not a lot of that is going to have to do with some of the funkier topics that you get to study when you get into a PhD program. So one of the things I would say,
college.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm sorry. College or PhD or whatever.
And we should say that overwhelmingly textbooks are still written by men,
Yeah.
way more than history monographs are.
And they're going to exactly. They're going to cover things that are very mainstream, non-controversial. I mean, what was it? Texas just decided that slavery was a major factor in the start of the Civil War. This year, it's going to
really
finally going to go into Texas textbooks. But once what can you learn from history? I mean, you can learn everything, right? You can learn everything. I mean, Marissa's entire dissertation has to do with breastfeeding, right? That's something that when I was in high school, I would have thought, it's not a history. There's no history of that.
Also,
right?
boobies.
yeah. There's no history of sex. Like sex is just a thing, right? It just happens. It's always happened. It's not affected by culture or society. There's no history of disability, right? It's just disabled people existed. And I think once you break out of that high school mold of what history is and isn't, and you start to see like, oh my God, you can read an entire book that, like you said, about the history of a comic book about Wonder Woman. Like that's your world is going to open up a little bit and it's going to be really cool.
And for no other reason than the fact that is the curriculum in high school. We, women and people of color and everybody need to be getting these advanced degrees so we can be the ones changing the AP exams.
Right.
And changing the curriculum.
Yeah. And
so that it's more inclusive and more controversial.
And having folks like our friend Elizabeth George or our friend Billy Pritchard, who are both teaching in high schools right now with their doctoral training, and changing the types of things that are being taught to students in high school and expanding their view of history. I think that, especially when talking about the viability of PhD programs, I mean, that's great. That's an excellent outcome, right?
Yes.
To train someone in a PhD and then send them out to teach even younger students isn't a failure. That's an incredibly great thing.
Okay.
Agreed.
I love this girl, by the way.
Can we adopt her?
Yes, send her.
Can we be her mom?
My final, I just wonder if you guys had any final thoughts to close us out with?
Oh man, I feel like we've talked about so
we
many
really have.
Done so much preaching today.
Yeah, we really have.
We also don't take ourselves too seriously and like to have fun. So I think that's something that a lot of listeners appreciate is that, we know our shit, but we do also sometimes, pronounce something wrong or have some kind of gaffe where we're laughing and it's funny. We don't pretend that we're perfect. I mean, that's something that academics do a lot.
and I think not just taking ourselves, pretending that we're perfect, but I think that it's important to write history with an acknowledgement that we're human, right? And that it's okay to be funny or tongue in cheek or, I made a couple of tongue-in-cheek comments in my book that I had one of my reviewers push back on and say that they were inappropriate and disrespectful. And I actually said, no, I'm keeping those in because I think they're funny and I think they're relevant to what I'm writing. And why not, right? Why not keep it so that it's accessible and funny? And I think that's one of the things that does make our podcast accessible to so many people is that we do let our own personalities come into it and we joke with each other and we do pronounce things wrong all the time. And
well, you do.
I do all the time. No, Elizabeth does.
Our Mistus Day.
Yes. Hey, come on.
Wow, it's almost like historians are people too.
Yeah.
Right. That's actually something that we need to remind people because for a lot of people, when they think like, oh, a history book, they think like, oh, it's so dry and boring. And like, I personally really strive to do the opposite, you know?
Okay. If you guys could just sign off, like kind of saying like where people could find you. Obviously the podcast is at www.digpodcast.org. And if you are listening to this and you're not listening to Dig Podcast, you should be ashamed of yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're on all kinds of social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. We have a specially for anyone who's a fan group, the Dig Pod Squad.
Dig History Pod Squad.
Which is on Facebook, so you can join, and Marissa will give you a fancy history meme as a welcome. And then people just like post weird questions and musings and things that they found in their own work that are historically relevant. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
And then you can always email us at hello@digpodcast.org if you have a question, comment, concerns, idea for
even a criticism.
Yeah,
we're open to those too.
Sometimes, yeah. And our Twitter handle is usually dig_history.
Great. Well, thank you so much, guys. This has been really wonderful. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been really fun.
Yeah.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.